Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Ian Gary. I'm the executive director of the Fact Coalition, and I'm really excited to welcome back to at least the Fact virtual space Oliver Bullough, who is an author many of you know. We had Oliver back a few years ago when he was talking to us about his book, Butler to the World. He has a new book out called um, Everyone Loves Their Dollars. And we're really excited to have a discussion with Oliver about what's wrong with our anti-money laundering system and how we can fix it. I'll be in conversation with Oliver for a little bit, and then we hope to have some opportunities for questions and answers. Um, Ian Gary, Executive Director of the Fact Coalition. I'm really happy to have you here. Oliver, you have, as we've noted, written several books related to dirty money, Moneyland, Butler to the World, and others. Prolific writer on this topic. With several books on dirty money under your belt, what prompted you to uh, get started on this book, research this topic, and lead you down this road?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ian, and really good to be here. I should apologize. This book isn't yet available in the United States. I hope it will be, but it isn't at the moment. So you're just going to have to take my word for it that it's an absolutely fascinating tour de force of investigative nonfiction. So yeah, this is it's a sort of third in a trilogy, I suppose, about financial crime, kleptocracy, the misuse of the financial system by bad actors to get away with their crimes. And this book is a little bit different to the others because, after the last two books that I wrote, which were quite critical of many aspects of the global financial setup, I'd received, quite a lot of feedback from politicians, policymakers, officials, bankers, law enforcement professionals, compliance people, and so on, saying that I was being a bit rude about them, that, they were just doing their best in a tough situation. And it really wasn't very helpful if you had someone on the outside, sitting there throwing rocks over the fence. And they felt that I was being a bit cruel and they were, doing their absolute best in really difficult circumstances. So I thought, well, that's interesting. And I'd take them at their word and say, well, okay, if they are doing their best in really difficult circumstances to try and stop global money laundering, why are they so completely failing to stop global money laundering? As far as we can tell from the statistics that we have, which obviously are not complete, financial criminals don't file necessarily complete tax returns and so on. So we don't have all of the data that we might have. But as far as we can tell, the proportion of the global economy that is made up of criminal money is basically exactly the same now as it was back in the 1990s before we built this whole, very intrusive, extremely expensive, bureaucratic architecture around trying to stop money laundering and terrorist financing. So, we have this very, very expensive system, which is completely failing to do the job we're asking of it. And if everyone involved is working as hard as they can, why is that? That struck me as a really interesting question. So, as ever with my books, I like to try and go back to the source of the phenomenon I'm describing, to go back to its birth and attempt to isolate the factors, what went wrong at the very beginning, where was the flaw baked into the pottery, if you will. Um, and that's what I've done. It also meant I had a lot of fun traveling to different places, including the piney woods of northeastern Texas, which was absolutely lovely, which perhaps we can get into a little bit later.
Yeah, I found the book really revelatory in terms of how the efforts to fight money laundering got started, but also highly entertaining. And you've done a great job creating a compelling narrative out of something that could be a very technical and sometimes dry topic. And you've, as you said, um, logged a lot of air miles going to places like Saipan in the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, to the Marshall Islands, and to Latvia and Arcana, Texas. Um, I think, why don't we turn now to, yeah, that trip you mentioned to Texas and why you went to Texas. and how that relates to the origins of the modern fight against money laundering.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting. The grandfather of all money laundering legislation, the guy who, as it were, created the idea of anti-money laundering legislation was a man called Wright Patman, congressman who represented the first congressional district of Texas from 1928 all the way up to 1974. One of those real veteran Southern Democrats, but I mean, though he's very much not a perfect guy in any stretch of the imagination, by the standards of Southern Democrats of the time, he was a really decent person. He particularly in his approach to um, financial regulation, his distrust of big financial institutions, he was pretty unrecognizable from the kind of people who might represent his district in Texas today. He grew up in real extreme poverty in a log cabin in a hamlet called Patman Switch, which has disappeared just outside the town of Hughes Springs, which is in northeastern Texas. He rode to school on a mule every day, lit the fire in the school in the morning, cleaned up in the evening to pay his way through school, paid his way through law school by picking cotton. Served in the military during World War One, and then after a bit of time as a state attorney, was elected to Congress in 1928. A lot of the things that he did in Congress are really extraordinary. And I mean there are two biographies of him, or a biography of him, and then a book which is kind of a semi-biography of him. And it's a sort of sign of quite how rich his career was. That neither of them really, one of them doesn't mention the birth of anti-money laundering legislation at all, and one of them only mentions it in a footnote. But he was towards the end of his career the chair of the House Banking Committee, and as such became concerned by the ease with which criminals were able to hide their wealth from the authorities because of the birth of offshore finance in the 1950s and 60s. And so he convened a series of hearings in his committee towards the end of the 1960s, looking particularly into issues around bank secrecy, which actually is why the legislation is always referred to as the Bank Secrecy Act, even though it's actually more of a Bank Transparency Act. And so he brought in this piece of legislation, which was passed in 1970, which brought in things like having to report transactions of $10,000 or over, which we're now completely accustomed to. But that was an innovation that he brought in. But really, I think his major contribution was a conceptual one. The idea that financial institutions and other professionals had a responsibility to society to check the origins of the money that they're moving around. That idea was a completely new one. If you look at how money laundering worked before that, or actually in other countries significantly after that, you can tell that this idea that banks should check the origin of funds was completely alien. I mean, there's a hilarious example, I think, from the UK. A few years later, there was a big gold bullion heist from a warehouse just near Heathrow Airport called the Brinks Map bullion robbery, which I think is still the second biggest heist in British history. Really huge amount of gold went missing. And the police forces of the whole country were on the lookout for this gold, trying to work out what was happening to it. And meanwhile, near Bristol, there was a very small gold bullion dealer who was taking so much cash out of his local bank branch that the Bank of England had to arrange special shipments of cash to the bank branch. They ended up shipping an additional £10 million worth of banknotes so he could buy all of this gold. And no one involved felt this was in any way suspicious or that they should report this to the authorities. There was no suspicious activity report or anything even remotely equating to that. And meanwhile, at the other end, he was handing this cash over in return for the gold. The gold was being paid into a bank branch in Essex near London, again, in huge quantities by people who really had no reason to have that much cash. And again, no one involved felt there was any need to report their suspicions. Bankers just didn't feel the need to do that. And the fact that that is now an accepted part of, the financial system, that compliance is a thing, that is something for which we can thank Wright Patman, or as the bankers like to call him because they didn't like him, wrong Patman.
And how did he get so seized with the problem of money laundering? What really got his goat, as you might say? And if you could expand further, why should people care about money laundering? What are the harms to everyday citizens in the US, in the UK, in Latvia, or the Marshall Islands. Can you talk a
Yeah,
bit about
so
that?
Wright Patman came from a really interesting political tradition in the American South and up in the Midwest, which was at the time referred to as the populist tradition. But I mean, the word populist has gained a different meaning now, meaning sort of over-promising, cynical politicians. In those days, the People's Party was born of the years after the American Civil War to try and create a fairer financial system, because at the time the debts that had been built up during the American Civil War were very much being dumped onto the poorest people in society, particularly farmers. And they wanted a fairer system, and they actually came up with some really imaginative solutions, many of which were considered to be, incredibly reckless and almost insane at the time, but now which we'd consider to be completely ordinary, like having a freely floating currency, and having a age of consent for young girls and for to engage in sexual intercourse higher than 12, things like that. I mean, they were really very ahead of their time. But by the time Wright Patman was born, that movement had been squashed by a real combination of well, Democratic pressure in the South and Republican pressure further north. But that the ideas within it, which included huge distrust of monopolies, huge distrust of big concentrated financial power, very much grew out of the Gilded Age. That was the political subculture that Wright Patman grew up in. And so that distrust of finance, the distrust of big business and monopolies, is something that he took to Washington and he kept on to throughout his political career. He never really changed his outlook. He never allowed himself to be bought by lobbyists. He was incredibly hardworking. He lived very frugally. He kept the same car from one end of a decade to the other. And so he was, very exercised by the need to overhaul the financial system. And it was, his campaigning against money laundering was all part of that. He saw that this was essentially a conspiracy between the financial sector and criminals to essentially diddle, the little man, as he referred to it, as he referred to sort of ordinary people out of their wealth, money that was being stolen was being hidden via the banks. And that gets into, why is money laundering a problem? Money laundering is the process whereby you take criminal wealth and move it through the financial system or some other form of the economy in order to make it look legitimate, so it can be spent without anyone being suspicious that it was the product of crime, which means that it's the support industry for all of the worst people in the world. If there is any form of acquisitive crime, whether that's people trafficking, drug trafficking, fraud, theft. I mean, something as mundane as mobile phone theft, which is a big thing we talk about a lot in the UK at the moment. That is enabled by money laundering. If you couldn't take the earnings of that crime and launder them and wash them through the financial system so they look clean and can be spent, then people wouldn't engage in those crimes in the first place. So this is why he felt it was necessary to tackle money laundering, because it was essentially a support industry for criminality. Back at the time when he was, coming up with these ideas, there was a lot of focus on the war on drugs. It wasn't. I don't think it was really called that yet, but the campaign against drugs, the campaign against delinquency in the inner cities, much of it was targeting people of ethnic minorities, and he felt that the crimes that they were committed were only happening because of the crimes of money laundering committed by largely white people living outside of the inner cities. And so he felt that it was a question of essentially fairness, that not only should you target street level criminals, but you should also target the people wearing white collars who launder their wealth. It was a really imaginative response to a particular challenge that the nation had at the time. And actually, I mean, interestingly, as a result of the Bank Secrecy Act that he passed, which was passed in 1970, he launched a congressional committee hearing in 1972 into a crime which had taken place in a hotel in Washington shortly before, which, of course, we now know as the Watergate scandal. Wright Patman's final act as a congressman was to launch the first inquiry into the Watergate scandal. And although he didn't manage to bust that open because of official opposition from the White House, he did manage to create enough, get enough of a paper trail that then led to a lot of the investigations that followed in the years ahead. So, he was it's in fact in a way because of this piece of legislation that the Watergate scandal was uncovered at all.
That's fascinating history. Looking now to the present day, we the Bank Secrecy Act is now almost 60 years old. There's a lot of conversation about modernizing, quote unquote, the Bank Secrecy Act. Sometimes we hear the word modernizing and we read it to mean weakening or, loosening the Bank Secrecy Act. The $10,000 threshold is still there. What if you were to, engage with people who are calling for modernizing the Bank Secrecy Act? What do you think that modernization effort should include?
I mean, the Bank Secrecy Act has been, already substantially overhauled and added to and chopped around with in the years since. I mean, the real flaw in, and he recognised this at the time, the flaw in Wright-Patman's conception is that, of course, if you're trying to, and in those days, money laundering largely consisted of taking cash and paying it into a bank. If you're preventing people from doing that in the United States, and a lot of this was happening in Florida, then it's very easy to put your cash in a plane and fly to the Bahamas, the Cayman Islands, Panama, Anguilla, wherever, one of the many, many jurisdictions that are just a short flight away from Florida. And so, it was really important to have international cooperation, which then the next bit of the book is then follows through the creation of the Financial Action Task Force, which is a kind of entertaining story in and of itself. But at the end of the 1980s, after a real concerted effort failed largely to crack down on money laundering within the United States, in terms of what is necessary, I mean, we need to recognize that money laundering is an intensely entrepreneurial activity, that the criminals engaging in it are constantly responding both to their desire to make it as cheap as possible, but also in their desire to avoid detection and make sure that they are not prosecuted for what they're doing. So it has become significantly more sophisticated than it was back in the sort of Miami Vice era of the 1980s. Particularly with its use of shell companies, bank accounts controlled by shell companies shuffling money between multiple different jurisdictions. So, certainly looking at the United States from the outside, the certainly one of the pieces of the jigsaw that's really missing in the US is corporate transparency. And it has been quite dismaying, to be honest, to see the fact that even though the Corporate Transparency Act was passed at the very end of the first Trump presidency, the fact that the second Trump presidency had seen that legislation really neutered and essentially, I mean, I know it still exists, but largely rendered a dead letter. That is, that's a real shame because, I'm not saying the rest of the world is perfect when it comes to shell companies, but a lot of progress has been made in other places, even in some of the really problematic British overseas territories. That hasn't, as a result of that, the changes that followed Trump's re-election. A lot of that hasn't happened in the United States. So, if I were to add, I mean, I have many wishes on my wish list, but if I were to have one wish to add to the arsenal of tackling financial crime in the United States, it would be for, more transparency, if only for law enforcement agencies, around who owns, the many different forms of corporate structure registered by all the different states.
Yeah, and that obviously very much aligns with our efforts here at the FAT Coalition. We'll talk more about that a bit later, but I want to come back to, the origin story of the Financial Action Task Force. And something I learned from the book is that the FATF started basically from a paragraph in a G Summit communique, and then sort of grew into something that people did not expect to happen. And the reason why there was that paragraph in the communique is a fascinating story as well, and takes us to France. So I was wondering if you could share a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a gloriously French story. Um, to be honest, sorry, I'm British. I can say things like that. We like, we like having digs at each other. We love the French, but we also like laughing at them, just like they like laughing at us. And in 1989, the French were due to chair the G7. It was also the bicentenary of the French Revolution, so it was a big, big year for France. But the preparations were, and were threatened to be overshadowed by this gloriously French political scandal, whereby a French state company had taken over an American company, and just a couple of weeks previously, several close allies of President Mitterrand, who was a socialist, had, entirely, I'm sure, coincidentally bought shares in the company that was about to be taken over. And when it was taken over, they'd made very substantial personal profits. These people included people like the bodyguard of Trotsky and stuff. It was all sort of wonderfully, incestuous. And so the press were having a field day, saying, socialism for everyone else, but crony capitalism for the insiders and so on. And President Mitterrand, in an attempt to try and regain the initiative, said that the G7 summit would propose measures to tackle, global financial crime, which came as a huge surprise to the other members of the G7 who had no idea that Mitterrand had any interest in this subject or was planning to do anything about this at all. And you can read in the government archives this sort of scramble to try and figure out what they were going to do about it. And you do see at the bottom of the G7 communique. I mean, 1989, as many people on this call may remember, was a pretty big year. That was a year when, not only was there the bicentenary, the French Revolution, but communism was falling apart in Eastern Europe. There was a détente with the Soviet Union as a result. There was a big sovereign debt crisis in Latin America. There was an awful lot going on. There was even concerns about climate change, improbably and prophetically enough. But right down there at the bottom of the communique, it says that summit participants will create, and they said a financial action task force. And financial action task force was written with small letters, not with capital letters. And it didn't say the financial action task force, it said a financial action task force. And having said this, they then had to try and form some working parties to work out what this meant. And they created 3 working groups headed by the Italians, the Americans, and the Brits to discuss various different aspects of what they were going to do. And working in a tremendous hurry in the last months of 1989, they drew up 40 recommendations for how countries should work to tackle financial crime and money laundering. And those 40 recommendations are largely unchanged. They still, largely speaking, are the same recommendations that the FATF now imposes on all the countries in the world. And I think, if we're looking for reasons why the Financial Action Task Force has failed to stop financial crime in any meaningful sense, I think certainly one of the key reasons is that its core recommendations were drawn up in a hurry in 1989 by people who didn't really know what they were talking about. Not only did they not know what they were talking about, but they were working in an economy that's wildly different to the one that we have now, and were representatives of countries who only represented a very particular kind of economy as well. The wealthy industrialized nations rather than, other places that do money laundering very differently. So, the FATF was never really intended to be an institution. It was supposed to be just a sort of a working group, but then it gained in this sort of wonderful way that bureaucracies occasionally do. It sort of gained a life of its own and has persisted to this day and retains this role as the standard setter tackling global money laundering, which it's very good at generating documents, but actually very bad when it comes to stopping money laundering in any meaningful sense.
And you say after the birth of the Financial Action Task Force that quote FATF was looking for places to punish,
Yeah,
unquote.
yeah. I mean, the obviously they were having drawn up these recommendations and joint standards that everyone in the country in the world should adopt. They then looked around the world and demanded everyone should adopt them. Now, there were a number of places that were genuinely big problems when it came to laundering money. I think everyone on this call is not going to be too surprised to learn that, for example, London was one of those places. Manhattan, Florida, Switzerland, the usual suspects, Singapore, Hong Kong. The kind of places that move large volumes of money are also the kinds of places that tend to move large volumes of criminal money. But the FATF had a sort of completist approach to what they wanted to do, and it was much more of a sort of box ticking exercise than actually looking at where criminal money is really moved. So instead of punishing those places, the places where money laundering actually genuinely happens, or sitting down amongst themselves and working out where the problems were and kind of creating a bespoke solution for each place, they instead had this sort of one size fits all approach to the standards that everyone should adopt, which meant that there were a number of countries who hadn't adopted those standards, including the one I focus on is the Marshall Islands, an archipelago in the Pacific, which is, I mean, the total surface area of the country is about the same as Washington, D.C., but it covers an area of ocean about the size of Mexico. It's a very far-flung collection of atolls with a huge social problems, many of which date back to the disruption caused by American nuclear tests in the 1940s and 50s, which caused a big displacement of the population, really, undermined the local economy. It has serious challenges, but among those challenges was not money laundering. There's no money there to launder, really. So they were no more interested in adopting standards against money laundering than they were in adopting standards around winter sports. It just wasn't an issue in the Marshall Islands for them to concern themselves about. So, but nonetheless, they got blacklisted and essentially excluded from the world economy for a couple of years because they hadn't passed the right pieces of legislation. Some of the other places that were blacklisted, my particular favorite is the island of Niue. I may be pronouncing that wrong, which is an associated territory of New Zealand that only had one bank. Laundering with only one bank is, I mean, it's a little bit like, trying to be a DJ with only one record player. I mean, it's technically possible, but you're not going to be able to do it very well. And that was essentially the approach of the Financial Action Task Force, was not to look at where money laundering really happened, but instead to have this very kind of theoretical consideration of where had the right laws, not whether laws were being actually enforced, but just whether you had them. And so, I think that is, although, I mean, they have tried to change that approach over the years, they've really struggled to actually make any headway in really doing so. And that's one of the reasons that the world has sort of so signally failed to actually stop money laundering.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Financial Action Task Force has over the years tried to move more from a technical compliance laws on the books approach to gauging the effectiveness of that country's anti-money laundering system. But you do say that, and this was in the early 2000s, quote, the world's wealthiest countries were pointing outwards and picking on places unable to defend themselves, as you mentioned, places like the Marshall Islands, accusing them of complicity with a crime that was far more likely to be taking place on their own territory. I think that's an important context to keep in mind now as the United States is being evaluated this year by the Financial Action Task Force. We expect on-site evaluators in Washington imminently. Do you think anything has changed in terms of your original assessment of FATF and basically picking on weaker countries and ignoring the problems of richer countries like the US? And how do you think the FATF might handle the US evaluation this year? What are your expectations?
Yeah, I mean,
Especially given the context, as we discussed, of significant rollbacks, including of the Corporate Transparency Act.
yeah, I mean, just before I came on the call, I was reading some news about Papua New Guinea, which is threatened with being blacklisted by the regional money laundering regional version of the FATF, which seems almost sort of farcically reminiscent of the blacklisting of the Marshall Islands. I'm sure Papua New Guinea is not a perfect place, but the idea that Papua New Guinea is a global center of money laundering is an absurdity. And I think the FATF has got a real problem this year with regard to the United States. They have previously finessed this with regard to inspections of the United Kingdom and France and other places that are, obviously major centers of criminal finance, but were at least able to tell a story that legislatively they were moving in the right direction. That obviously isn't what's happening in the United States. The gutting of the Bank Secrecy Act is gutting of the Corporate Transparency Act is a clear sign of that. But also the enabling of crypto, the receptiveness to some really questionable companies to list on markets in New York is a sign that that the United States is really moving in a different direction to what it used to be, and this creates a really difficult dynamic for the rest of the world because as I made clear earlier, the very idea of anti-money laundering was invented in the United States. That's Wright Patman's idea. It's been driven by a number of very imaginative legislators and officials and politicians in the US. The US has always been at the forefront of prosecuting financial institutions, levying the biggest fines, engaging in the most ambitious investigations, bringing, jailing people who in other countries would very much not have been jailed. The fact that we now have a situation where, the president of Honduras has been pardoned for engaging in some crimes which, were pretty shocking, to be honest, from the standards of money laundering. Um, we're entering into a new world, and it's going to be a real challenge for the Financial Action Task Force, which very much has a sort of horse trading, diplomatic horse trading at the center of itself. It's very much one of those organizations where, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And the countries that are at the table are, the big Western economies, always led by the United States. And this situation is a really challenging one, because the FATF is kind of, it's an existential question. If they do criticize the United States, then it's hard to believe that the current administration in the US is going to take that very kindly. If they don't criticize the United States, it's hard to believe that the rest of the world is going to take that very kindly. So it's a really difficult time. And as for making a prediction about it, I'm not going to do that, but I'm glad that it's not me who has to undergo this, do this particular work. Though it is always possible that if this provokes a crisis, it could create a better version of the FATF in future, which wouldn't in many ways be a bad thing.
Yeah, that sort of leads to my next question. Can can the Financial Action Task Force be reformed? Is there a foundation of usefulness there that a group of like-minded countries with the right ideas could build upon? The UK will hold the presidency of FATF starting, I believe, July 1st. So with the current UK government prioritizing the fight against illicit finance, um, taking on the presidency of the Financial Action Task Force, uh, hosting the G20 next year, there seems to be a lot of eyes on the British government in terms of its role in the uh, combating of illicit finance, especially in the unfortunate case, the U.S. pulling back from that fight. What do you think the UK should do with the FATF presidency, and how do you think that institution might be reformed?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real issue with what you might refer to more broadly as a sort of anti-money laundering industrial complex. There is a huge global compliance industry, as well as more broadly the FATF and associated similar regional bodies, who are all driven by the same. I mean, I think you might call it dogma, really, which was drawn up by the FATF back in 1989, and then, of course, refined or added to in 2001 after the attacks of 9/11 on New York and Washington. Those principles which have been drawn up are never really questioned in any meaningful sense. Um, I think that they should be questioned, and I also think that it would be worth questioning whether a genuinely global body of this nature is actually what we need. It strikes me that there is a real risk of tackling financial crime all in one go, of sort of trying to boil the ocean. It's just too big a topic, and also you're bundling a huge number of different things together. It seems to be a little bit like wanting to start a healthcare system and just saying that you're going to cure ill health all in one go. Obviously that's a worthy goal and a good thing to think about, but that's not how you cure ill health. You cure each phenomenon differently with different tools and a different approach. And I think that having committed government action against individual manifestations of financial crime would probably be although a less sort of ambitious and less sort of sweeping and perhaps less grand approach, would probably bring better results in the long term, than setting out with a kind of very maximalist approach. So I mean, I have been talking to a few British officials about my opinion, with the build up to the FATF and the G20 and the illicit finance summit in the summer, and all these things. And that's very much what I'm saying, is trying to be more effective and by being less ambitious. This sort of solve financial crime, all of it all together in one go, is wildly unrealistic. And I think that it's a real problem of making the perfect the enemy of the good, and that's something that we should all be aware of.
Yeah, I want to turn to some some of these emerging issues. You get a sense reading the book that the world has been unsuccessful in fighting traditional money laundering, while at the same time new threats are emerging on the horizon, such as the threats posed by digital assets and crypto and money laundering. And I think you touch on that a bit towards the end of the book. Could you talk a bit about those challenges and how we are either prepared or vastly unprepared for the money laundering threats related to those issues?
Yeah, I mean, I was keen not to write about crypto particularly just because I find crypto people kind of insufferable. I find, these interminable podcasts where people with podcasts interview other people with podcasts for like 4 hours at a time. It seems almost like a cult to me, and so I try and avoid it. But anyway, it is important and obviously significant, so I did have to engage with it, and I'm glad I did actually because it's made it a much more complete treatment of modern manifestations of money laundering. I'm not particularly worried about all crypto. I think that, I mean, I'm afraid I'm one of these people who doesn't think that there's any particularly useful function to crypto. I mean, I can understand that it's good for financial speculation and, fine if that's what you're into. It doesn't seem any more interesting than gambling on sports to me and possibly less interesting. More broadly, however, particularly stable coins, of which, the most well known are, of course, USDT and USDC, and the big ones all tend to be pegged to the US dollar, and therefore their companies tend to be very big purchasers of US government debt to maintain those pegs. I think they are a real problem, and a growing threat, and something that is underappreciated in future. I mean, we have, one of the phenomena that has underpinned the not just the battle against money laundering, but also the battle against rogue states, has been the US dominance of the global financial system via the dollar monopoly. The fact that transactions have to clear via New York has given the US a degree of jurisdiction over the activities of the Russian regime or whatever, which has been a genuine source of strength and a real source of vulnerability for Putin and other allied actors. What stable coins give criminals is the ability to transact in dollars without US jurisdiction. And what we're seeing now with the use of stable coins by, say, Colombian drug cartels, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the scam factories in Cambodia, which are being run by particularly big Chinese organized crime groups. The huge globally diversified Chinese money laundering networks, which we're seeing manifestations of in the US and Canada and the UK and the EU, Australia, absolutely everywhere. So much of what they do now involving moving value is by moving value in stable coins. And that I think is really underappreciated. And actually, I'm very alarmed by the talk in Washington that these are good because they're a source of demand for US government debt. Although they are a source of demand for US government debt, it's really a bit of a rounding error compared to how much US government debt there is out there. And in terms of the long-term damage that will be caused by surrendering control of the US dollar system, it just seems an incredibly short-sighted calculation to think that these are a good idea. And also, just while I'm on that topic, I'm currently writing an article, researching an article about A7A5, which is the largest non-US dollar denominated stable coin. It's denominated to the Russian ruble. And although it's relatively small by its size compared to the big dollar stable coins, it's a really worrying sign of what might be ahead in terms of essentially geopolitical adversaries creating their own forms of cryptocurrency and therefore their own payment mechanisms completely outside of Western oversight or control. And I think we will really miss the formal old-fashioned financial system when it's gone, because it did give both a degree of oversight and a degree of control and influence over the global economy, which it was very valuable.
Great. Just to remind folks who are online that we'll take some questions. So if you have questions, do pop them into the Q&A. I know that some people are really fascinated, including myself, about your investigative, techniques, how you do your reporting, how you do your research. And one of the one of the parts of the book that was most fascinating to me was your trip to Saipan. And if you could talk a little bit about that and how you got so close to really, I have to say, insane trove of information about money laundering that was going on in casinos in Saipan. Talk a little bit about how you got to that information.
Yeah, I mean, Saipan, for people who don't know where it is, I don't know how well known it is in the US. It's one of those sort of amazing bits of American territory that isn't part of the United States. It's the chain of islands from which the airplanes took off to drop the atomic bombs on Japan towards the end of World War II. So, it's very much at the other end of the Pacific. It's actually shorter in distance covered for me to fly to Saipan from London than it is for you guys to fly to Saipan from Washington, D.C. It's a really long way away. It's super beautiful as well, though. If you're tempted to go, it's a really gorgeous place, a real gorgeous destination. Why I was there was not sightseeing, but because it has had this really bad habit of building casinos in an attempt to support the local economy, which have essentially become truly gigantic money laundering destinations. Yeah, there are two main islands. Tinian, the smaller of the two, got into this first. They built a casino called the Dynasty, which got very involved in laundering money, particularly money coming out of China. It was eventually shut down after being hit with a absolutely colossal fine by FinCEN, who finally noticed what was happening and did an investigation. But by that point, a new group had come in to build a casino in Saipan, the main island with most of the population. And the casino is just the most extraordinary building. It stands, it is by far the biggest building on the island. It's like stands up like a grain elevator on the prairie. You can see it from absolutely everywhere. And it is, astonishingly tasteless. Building. It's covered in sort of carvings and statues and gold,
So
bits.
dictator chic.
I mean, like properly. I mean, well, worse. I mean, I lived in Russia during the sort of high point of the Putin boom, and I don't think I ever saw anything as tasteless as the casino in Saipan. It's properly off the chain, and inside it has these unbelievable sort of jeweled dragons, astonishing. But basically, it was never really intended to be a proper casino. It was always a giant money laundering front. The reason I wanted to write about it was to contrast this, just to try and demonstrate the hypocrisy and conflicts of interest within the FATF, because this is geographically speaking relatively close to the Marshall Islands. I'm not saying the Marshall Islands doesn't have problems. It has a ship registry which is a bit problematic. It does have a corporate registry which isn't great, though certainly no worse than what you would find in the United States, and a good deal smaller. And also the ship registry is run out of Virginia, so I mean that's kind of a US problem anyway. I mean it was set up, with funding from the State Department. But the in terms of laundering money, like genuine colossal quantities, the CNMI has been a massive problem. It's been a real hole in the US defenses against particularly specifically Chinese money laundering. And obviously because it's under US jurisdiction, it was not in any way punished. There was no blacklisting for the CNMI because it was part of the US, and therefore things that would have been I mean unimaginably bad if they'd taken place in the Marshall Islands were just more or less ignored. And that was the reason I wanted to tell that story. Also, it's just a fun story in and of itself. But yeah, in what you were referring to about the treasure trove of documents, I visited Tinian, where there's a derelict casino, the smaller of the two derelict casinos. And much to my surprise, I realised I could break in quite easily because someone had smashed a window. And so it's possible to climb into the casino, which was like a post-apocalyptic. It's like someone had just shut the door one day and it still had all the room keys, and everything was just as it had been left. But in the VIP gaming room was like a trolley with all of the register of all the documents of the junkets who'd organised the money laundering. And that was a really terrifying thing to find. I have to say, it was by far the most scared I was while finding this book, because the last thing that a Chinese money laundering gang wants is for their innermost secrets to be broadcast to the world, and that was what I was then looking at. It was an extraordinary place, the CNMI. Really underappreciated. I know it's difficult to get to from the US. You'd have to go via Guam, but it is. I'd highly recommend people visiting if they have the opportunity. It's really very very different indeed.
Put it on my bucket list.
Yeah, I mean, literally, I do think if I was a sort of Tony Stark-esque, tech oligarch, I would build myself a palace, like overhanging the sea in the CNMI. It's got the whole James Bond villain vibe.
Great. Well, one last question for me, and then I know we do have some good questions in the Q&A. You end with the chapter on what should be done, and you talk about we can do better. Um, and you say it takes imagination, commitment, and a desire to succeed, and resources. So you end on a bit of hope. But what are your top recommendations in terms of what should be done um, uh, in this fight against dirty money?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, which is by far the most useful tool for any criminal laundering money is cash, banknotes. I had quite a lot of fun visiting the factories where the Federal Reserve prints its dollar bills, or let's be honest, it's $100 bills because most of the things they print are $100 bills. And the role of cash in money laundering is often under discussed because it's just a bit sort of old hat. Everyone knows, and it's always more interesting to talk about the new shiny things like crypto. If I were able to set the agenda for the G7 this year, assuming it goes ahead, I would try and seek commitments from the countries to phase out the printing of big bills. Phase out. I mean, $100 bill, 80% by value of the dollars being printed are in the form of $100 bills, which is incredible because you don't see them very often. The majority of those, sort of 70 or 80%, go overseas, which is to say that something like $100 billion worth of $100 bills are exported every year from the US, which as an export industry is probably more valuable than pharmaceuticals. It's an incredible amount of cash going overseas, largely going overseas to enable criminality. So phasing out those big bills and doing so also in the UK, where we have a £50 note, in Switzerland, where they have £1,000 note, and in the EU, where they have 200 and €100 bills, would be, I think, the lowest hanging fruit in terms of having the biggest impact on inconveniencing the big cartels, the terrorist groups, and so on. Crypto regulation is super important as well. Beneficial ownership transparency is super important. All of those things, but those are technical and difficult. Just phasing out big bills would be so easy. I mean, this isn't even a new idea. People have been talking about this for a long time, but it never just seems to stick.
It seems like a simple and obvious a fix. So turning to some of the questions that we have, and one of the first question is that I'll pick is one that I think you address in a chapter in your book. The question is NGOs and civil society organizations, especially those working in closed countries that criminalize civic work, often get caught up in anti-money laundering compliance problems. How should the global financial oversight world balance criminal AML activity with legitimate but quote unquote underground civic work? And I would add, how do nonprofit organizations often get swept up in this compliance regime?
It's such an important question. I think one of and just to answer it slightly discursively, I think one of the problems with the system that we've built is because it is so ineffective. We have built a system that is ever more intrusive, trying to make it more effective by giving essentially governments and financial institutions greater powers to look past what would once have been considered to be private information. And that is, I mean, you could say fine or not fine. If a government is well intentioned, at least it's not harmful. But the problem is, of course, if you give those very, very intrusive powers to a government that intends harm against, civil society organizations, political enemies, and so on, then it becomes a really powerful tool to be used against those organizations. We've seen this an awful lot in countries like Russia, to a certain extent, in places like Hungary and Turkey, obviously in China to a huge extent as well. I think that it is a big problem, and I don't really know how we can answer it, because the entire system that we have, and this is another reason why I think the system should be reformed, is based on what in Britain is occasionally rather sarcastically referred to as the good chap model of government. That, essentially, everything's fine because we're all good chaps. But if you're not, then suddenly you have a problem because you've given people powers that they really have no intention of using proportionately or with good intentions. So yeah, it's a real problem, and yeah, it's something I did talk about in the book, particularly in relation to anti-terrorism legislation and regulations.
Great. The next question I have is, let's see. I think one of the impacts of the money laundering system is on different asset markets. This question is outside of the principal problem you cite, support system for criminal activity. Does the price and elasticity of laundered money have nefarious or inflationary impact in key asset markets such as real estate?
I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, it clearly does have an inflationary impact in particular kinds of real estate. I mean, I think certainly in big hotspots like West London, Southern Florida, bits of Los Angeles and so on. I think that there's no question that there has been that side effect. More broadly, however, I find it really interesting, particularly when we haven't got on to talking about trade-based money laundering, but the role of trade-based money laundering, where, for example, if there's a very large flow of cocaine into the United States, there has to be a reverse flow of goods out of the United States to balance those trade flows. 'Cause some of that is happening in cash, but an awful lot will be happening in manufactured goods, which is absolutely great for a certain kind of US exporter. So, the extent we really don't appreciate or discuss the extent of how much money laundering is embedded in the real economy. It's very visible in Europe in exports of luxury goods to China. You see that in a really big way, particularly with in places like France, Italy, and the UK, where there are big luxury goods companies and so on. So the role of property, yeah, certainly as an endpoint for laundered goods, but also other whether it's expensive watches, expensive handbags, things like that, as a concentrated store of value for moving money around, it is really interesting and not really discussed.
One last question from me then. Turning back to your previous book and the book that we had you on to discuss a few years ago, which was Butler to the World, um, looking at how UK service providers support criminals and corrupt kleptocrats to move money through the UK financial system. Since that book came out, um, there's been new economic crimes legislation, reforms to the beneficial ownership regime and improvements at Companies House. The UK now is, as you mentioned, hosting the Illicit Finance Summit at the end of June. Um, are these sort of window dressing measures, or have you seen appreciable, real improvements in how the UK has dealt with its dirty money problem since that book came out?
There has been improvement. I mean, certainly. I mean, you mentioned beneficial ownership in that regard. The reforms around that have been positive. I mean, we still have an open beneficial ownership registry that anyone can access from anywhere for free, which is great. But it is more expensive now to register a company or a change of information with it. And that information, it's not perfect, but it's better than it used to be in terms of the verification of that information. Um, so there has been progress. There's still quite a long way to go in that regard. There are also various changes proposed around anti-money laundering regulators to make them, more concentrated and better resourced. Also, more money is going into financial crime enforcement and stuff. It's not enough, but it is better than it used to be. So there has been some progress. In it, yeah. It's to use a sort of British football metaphor. We were sort of down in the relegation zone, and now we're more, a bit more towards the middle of the table. But we're definitely not, at the top of the Premier League at the moment.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. And as I said at the outset, the book is a highly entertaining read and a an interesting travel log, and as well as a great history of how this modern anti-money laundering system came to be, the weaknesses therein, and what we can do about it. And I really commend the book to everyone who has a chance to read it. Several people in the Q&A said that they've been able to obtain copies here, including buying from Blackwell's and get it shipped to the US, abe.com. I think you can get it on Kindle via Amazon. So we'll find ways to smuggle your text into the United States,
Yeah.
Oliver. And we really appreciate you taking the time to chat with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate everyone staying on the call and listening. It's been really great to share some thoughts. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Take
Okay.
care, everyone.
Cheers. Bye bye.